All right, listener name. Today we're going deep into the world of international law and political asylum. You ready?
You could say that, yeah. It's like a John Grisham thriller, but with real-world consequences.
Exactly. We're taking a close look at a report by Maxim Kharitonov. He's a top expert witness on human rights violations
Mm.
and political repression in Russia and the former Soviet republics.
What's fascinating about Maxim's work is that it connects academic research with actual legal battles. He's been a consultant on over 100 cases, helping lawyers in both the UK and the US understand the dangers people face if they're forced back to these countries.
Yeah, he's not just talking about it, he's giving hard evidence that can win or lose an asylum case. The report we're looking at today, it was for a UK law firm, and it's all about a possible case of political persecution in Russia.
It's complicated, even more so because of this whole dual nationality thing between Russia and Kazakhstan. Officially, Kazakhstan doesn't recognize dual nationality, so if you become a citizen of another country,
You lose your Kazakh citizenship,
automatically.
you could end up stateless.
Yeah,
That's a scary thought, especially in a region as politically charged as that.
absolutely. And that's where this particular case gets even trickier. It's not clear if this person officially gave up their Kazakh nationality when they became a Russian citizen.
So they might still be a Kazakh citizen, at least on paper, even if Kazakhstan doesn't recognize it.
Exactly.
That sounds like a legal minefield.
It is, and it could really impact their asylum claim. This brings up a big question. Could they even go back to Kazakhstan safely? It might seem like an option, but we have to think about how close Kazakhstan and Russia are.
And those extradition treaties we've talked about.
Exactly. Kazakhstan has sent people back to Russia before, especially those who's, well, let's just say fallen out of favor. This case really shows just how complicated international law can be, and the real danger is when you mix political persecution with citizenship issues and extradition.
It's like trying to untie a really messed up knot, with every strand being a legal problem or a political risk.
That's a good way to put it. To really understand how serious this is, we need to look closer at the political situation in Chechnya, which is a big part of Maxim's report.
From what I understand, things in Chechnya under Ramzan Kadyrov are pretty bad, repressive.
Wow.
This report doesn't try to hide that, does it?
Not at all. Maxim describes a very difficult life under Kadyrov. Lots of fear, very real threat of violence for anyone who speaks out against the government.
So it's not just activists or journalists who are at risk, but anyone who criticizes the government, even in private.
Right. Maxim points out that they use all sorts of tactics to keep people quiet. Arrests, torture, even going after their families.
Wow. That's chilling. It sounds like there's no such thing as freedom of speech in Chechnya.
That's the reality for a lot of people living under Kadyrov. The report talks about people being arrested for no reason, brutal interrogations, forced to confess to things they didn't do.
That's awful, just to be completely at the mercy of a system that disregards human rights like that.
And the fear isn't just for yourself. Maxim talks about how they go after families as a way to control people, to keep them quiet. If you even think about speaking out, you have to ask yourself, is it worth risking my safety or my family's safety?
That's a heartbreaking situation.
Right.
It really shows how deep the fear runs in Chechnya.
It does. And this fear reaches beyond Chechnya's borders. Maxim's report looks at how they influence things in other parts of Russia, even in neighboring countries.
So even if you get out of Chechnya, you might not be safe. That makes you wonder if it's even worth trying to find refuge in Russia or in places like Kazakhstan, given how close they are to Russia.
You've hit on a very important point. Maxim's analysis suggests that moving might not protect you from the Chechen authorities. This case really shows how someone's personal struggle for asylum is tied to the bigger geopolitical situation.
So they're caught between political persecution and these legal complexities. It doesn't sound hopeful.
No, it doesn't. And this is just the beginning of our deep dive into Maxim's report. We still need to unpack the tactics they use to force people into fighting in Ukraine and what that means for this asylum case.
That's what I find so interesting about Maxim's work. He's not just an expert in law or politics. He understands how these conflicts affect real people. I'm really interested to hear more about that.
I think you'll find it very insightful, listener name. Maxim cuts through the legal jargon and all the bureaucracy to show us the real human stories behind all of this.
Well, let's get to it then. I want to explore those stories that don't always make the headlines.
Let's do it. I think you'll find what Maxim has to say in this next section particularly compelling.
So we've got this incredibly complicated situation. Political persecution, dual nationality issues, and the reality of life in Chechnya. But there's something else too, right? This pressure to fight in Ukraine. Sometimes they're basically forcing people.
This is where Maxim's work on human rights is so important. He doesn't just tell you what's happening. He digs into the methods they use. It's not always about brute force. It's more like a system designed to trap people.
So it's more psychological, not just physical force.
Right. Take financial incentives, for example. When the economy is bad, the promise of a lot of money, it can be really tempting, especially for young men who don't have many opportunities.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Huh.
Especially in a place like Chechnya, where there's a lot of poverty and unemployment.
But it's not just about offering rewards. There are threats, too. Sometimes they're direct, sometimes more subtle, against individuals and their families.
Like they might threaten to arrest them on fake charges. Or even worse, hurt their families if they don't cooperate. That's scary.
It is. They're preying on people's instincts.
Yeah.
You want to protect yourself and the people you love. It puts you in a terrible position. Risk your own life in a war you might not even support. Or put your family in danger by refusing.
It's a no-win situation. And all this is happening while they're being bombarded with propaganda.
Exactly. Maxim talks about how the Russian media is constantly pushing this narrative, glorifying the war, demonizing anyone who questions it. It makes speaking out dangerous and socially unacceptable.
So they're basically manufacturing consent, using money, threats, and propaganda to make fighting in Ukraine seem like the only option for a lot of Chechens.
That's a good way to put it. And this makes it even harder for people like the person in this asylum case to say they're truly fleeing persecution. How do you prove you're refusing because you're genuinely afraid when everyone's telling you that refusing makes you a coward or a traitor?
So if they're sent back to Russia, what could happen to them? The report doesn't make it sound good.
No, it doesn't. Maxim is very clear about the risks. They could be arrested for no reason, detained, tortured. And even if they avoid that, they'll probably be watched constantly, harassed, and always under threat of being forced into the military.
That's a terrifying thought. It really highlights how important Maxim's work is. He's giving a voice to people who can't speak for themselves, showing us what life is really like for those who stand up to the Chechen authorities.
And it's bigger than just Chechnya. What we're seeing here is part of a larger fight for human rights and freedoms in Russia and the surrounding region. It reminds us that these aren't just abstract ideas. They have real consequences for people caught in the middle of all this.
It's a lot to take in. It makes you wonder about the limits of international law and what the rest of the world can do in situations like this. What responsibility do other countries have to protect people who are fleeing this kind of danger?
That's a question worth thinking about. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by how complicated all of this is. But as Maxim shows us, behind the legal terms and the politics, there are real people whose lives are at stake.
Lives that are being changed forever by political repression, forced conscription, and this overwhelming fear.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the heart of it all, listener name, this individual seeking asylum. Maxim's report isn't just a legal document. It's a story about the human cost of these conflicts and a call for justice for those who are often overlooked.
It shows us the harsh realities for those who dare to resist or question those in power. You realize how fragile freedom is and the lengths some will go to crush it.
And it highlights the need for a more compassionate and just approach to asylum, one that recognizes the true dangers people are facing. But I think we can explore this more as we move into the final part of Maxim's report.
You're right. There's still so much to discuss. This case has really opened my eyes to how international law, human rights, and the fight for freedom in this region are all connected. I'm ready to see where Maxim takes us next.
Let's do it. I think the insights in this last section will give us a lot to think about as we wrap up this deep dive.
As we go through Maxim's report, I keep thinking about how much he understands. It's not just the law and the politics.
Right. He sees how these conflicts affect real people. For example, how the Chechen authorities use family ties against people.
We talked about that a bit earlier. I'd like to hear more about how that works.
Okay, so for a lot of Chechens, family is everything. It's a huge part of their culture and who they are. The authorities know that, so they threaten families, because that's often more effective than threatening the person directly.
So it puts them in a terrible spot. If you protect yourself, your family might get hurt.
Yeah.
But if you try to protect them, you might be the one in danger. That's a horrible choice to have to make.
Exactly. It's psychological manipulation. They're not just trying to hurt people physically. They're trying to break them mentally and emotionally.
In this asylum case, with the dual nationality issue and the possibility of being sent back, it kind of reflects this whole struggle, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It shows how the system is designed to silence people. whether it's through violence or through these more subtle tactics.
That makes Maxim's work even more important. He's not just an expert witness, he's fighting for those who don't have a voice, for those who are forgotten.
He's putting himself at risk by speaking out against these regimes. Challenging someone like Kadyrov is not easy.
It shows how brave people are who stand up to this kind of injustice, and how important it is to make sure their stories are heard.
Yeah. And it reminds us that the fight for human rights is never over. It's happening on so many levels: legal, political, and personal.
So as we wrap up this deep dive listener name, what's the main takeaway from Maxim's report?
I think it's this. Human rights aren't just words. They're about real people's lives. And those rights are in danger in many parts of the world.
And the threats aren't always straightforward. It's not just violence. There are complex legal issues and psychological manipulation, too.
Exactly. Maxim's report makes us look beyond the headlines, at all the things that cause these human rights crises.
And to think about our own role as global citizens. What can we do to support justice? And hold those in power accountable.
That's a great point to end on. Maxim's work is a call to action. It reminds us that we can't just ignore injustice. We have to pay attention, we have to care, and we have to keep fighting for what's right. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.